Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we always appreciate the courtesy of seeing that cell phones have been muted as we prepare to begin. And for our internet viewers, they are reminded that we can take their questions or comments at any time simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program following today's presentation for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our discussion is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. He began his Capitol Hill career as a policy aide to Senator John McCain, focusing on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. He later served as senior professional Republican staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, advising on East Asia affairs. He then joined the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, served as the council's senior country director, representing American interests in Indonesia and Singapore. And before being named the council's senior vice president and executive director, he held these posts for 4 years. He is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads a graduate seminar on American foreign policy interest in Southeast Asia. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thanks, John. Thanks. Darn, I'm sorry it's so cold in here. I should have brought a scarf or something. I'm freezing. Well, thanks for coming out. It's been a big last few days actually on this whole set of issues. It's for anyone that was around watching this 25 years ago or so, it's a little bit disorienting, really. It's a great relief, I think, that the elections came off as well as they seem to have, if not exactly free and fair, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. It really is a remarkable turn of events just watching the press and reading about it here, and we've got some folks that can talk a lot more to that, that have some experience on the ground and know what the situation is like. We're just at the beginning of the process is sort of the only caution I would put out there to begin with. The votes still have to be counted officially. Coalitions have to be built, et cetera. We're in a long interregnum period between now and when a government actually comes together that can govern. So there's a lot to be done over the next many months. But I don't think you can but be cautiously optimistic about the outcome of the elections and some of the outreach and that sort of thing that's taken place over the last several days. But I could share with you my own thoughts on that, but I don't want to preempt our guests. We brought them in for a reason. That's to talk to us and give us their terrific expertise. First, I'm going to turn to Kelly Curry. Kelly is a senior fellow with Project 2049 Institute, where since 2009 she's worked on issues related to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in the Asia Pacific. She's also founding director of their Burma Transition Initiative. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that in the process of your comments. Kelly joined Project 2049 several years ago after serving as a policy advisor to Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky. A lot more I could talk about on her resume, including some time she spent on Capitol Hill working, but I don't want to detract from the amount of time we have there for discussion. So let me just let Kelly start, and then we'll go and I'll introduce each of the other panels as we go on. So Kelly, take it.
Thank you so much, Walter. It's a real pleasure to be here at Heritage this morning. I just got back from Burma on Tuesday night, so everything is still pretty fresh in my mind, and I'm still actually trying to sort through my impressions and my experience there during the elections and immediately after. And so I'm going to be pretty impressionistic and but welcome the opportunity to answer questions and to follow up about more specific things. As Walter says, I am the founder of the Burma Transition Initiative, for what that's worth, at Project 2049. It was something that we decided to do back in 2012 as things were starting to change a little bit in Burma, and we saw an opportunity to work there in a way that hadn't previously been possible. I've been working on Burma now for almost 20 years in various guises, mostly on policy side, but also working with the democracy movement on the ground including with IRI back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I have a long history of working with the Burmese democracy movement and human rights activists and civil society and ethnic nationalities in Burma. And so this personally has been a tremendously gratifying and wonderful week to see what has happened, to see the Burmese people again stand up for democracy, stand up to military dictatorship, and assert their voices in this way. After years of being told by experts that the NLD was a spent force, that Burmese people didn't really care about democracy, they were more interested in economic development, and that and then more recently, since 2010, that if the USDP could manage technical aspects of economic growth and introducing more openness, that the Burmese people would probably just be satisfied with that because it's just so much better than what they had before 2010. These patronizing and condescending views have totally also been repudiated along with the military's governance style. So I just want to start out with those framing remarks and then kind of jump into some other things. It has been amazing how consistently people have underestimated the NLD and its capacity at the grassroots. This party has been the regime has tried to decimate this party for 25 years now, and they have utterly failed. And it's also been amazing how underestimated the Burmese people's hatred for this regime has been totally underestimated by most experts. Also, the polling data, limited as it was, turned out to be completely wrong. It showed a much tighter race. And I think that a lot of the early criticisms of this polling data, much of which was waved away by the experts, again, has turned out to be extremely true, that it is difficult to ask people their political opinions and get an honest opinion in a country like Burma. And even when you do all the things methodologically that you would normally do with a poll to try to correct for those things, it's still incredibly difficult to get people to tell you what they think. So one thing, though, that's good about the polling data, if I can say this, is that it may have given the USDP a false sense of security and may have led them to not cheat as much as they otherwise would have because they did not believe that they were in such a hole with the Burmese people. So we can actually maybe thank the bad polling for for that outcome. Which I don't think I would ever say anything like that, but that's, this is Burma, so you end up with very strange things happening. That said, and because the USDP, I always believed that they would calibrate their level of cheating to only do as much as they thought they needed to kind of stay in the game. This landslide has just wiped out that whole strategy. But I don't discount the possibility that in the next couple weeks, as the numbers continue to be officiated and we deal with problems around advanced voting, the advanced voting was hugely problematic. It largely took place in military areas. The military is the largest block of advanced votes. And so I don't discount that we could still see problems around these two areas, advanced voting and manipulation of the count. On the manipulation of the count, however, the NLD did a spectacular job on their parallel poll and on their parallel count. And they knew by Monday night that they had won a supermajority with their unofficial account. And they did a great job. I mean, I can't say enough good things about how organized the NLD was on the ground, which is, again, not one of those things that you ever heard from the experts, that the NLD was super organized. They have polling people, they have polling agents everywhere. Their polling agents had their sheets. They were turning everything in. Their local offices, even in Chin State, which is very remote, and that's where it was during the election, and hadn't really been considered an NLD stronghold. It was expected that the ethnic parties would do pretty well in Chin State and that the USDP would do well in Chin State because they had just come out of a massive flood and landslide period in Chin State where the USDP thought they had done a really great job of responding to the disasters up there. So, but the NLD swept. I mean, just in Phalam, where I was, this township in the middle of Chin State, the NLD just obliterated everybody else. It wasn't even close. And one of the local Chin parties was running a very good campaign with a very modern message and young, exciting candidates. didn't matter. It didn't matter at all. One of those candidates is one of my very good friends, and I had to sit with her on election night going through this horrible process of losing her election. But at the same time, we're looking at what's going on around the country and getting reports slowly in. And, you know, it was a very weird experience to sit with someone losing their election and also trying to celebrate the national triumph of the NLD that was slowly emerging. Let's see, what else? In Chin State in particular, it was very interesting how strategic the voters were. This was, again, not something I expected to see. That they very clearly told me, and they, again, within 5 minutes of arriving in Falam, everybody there knew who I was and what I was there doing. It's a tiny little town. And they knew I was friends with this person who was running for another party, but yet they would walk up to me in tea shops or on the street and tell me, we're voting for the NLD. We like your friend, Cherry. She's a wonderful person, but she's very young. She'll have another chance. We need the NLD to come in and get rid of the generals. These were votes of protest and resistance, very clearly, at least in Chin State, and I think in a lot of other places as well. And I think that in many of the ethnic areas, you've seen this. Jen's gonna go into more detail, but with the exception of Kachin and Shan, which are the heavy conflict areas, which are most subject to manipulation by the USDP, then you've seen this in most of the ethnic nationalities areas where the ethnic parties did far worse than expected and the NLD did far better. And I attribute this to strategic voting by people who were not expected to vote strategically. Again, underestimating the Burmese people, and it just keeps, it's amazing. I think that right now, going forward, the NLD so far has been saying and doing all the right things. They've been focused on national reconciliation and having a smooth transition with the military, inviting the authorities, the president, the current president and the commander-in-chief to have talks along with the ethnic nationalities about how to effect a smooth transition of power. And this is really important, but their other priorities include constitutional reform, the release of political prisoners. They issued a statement just in the past 24 hours saying this would be a top priority, and it's worth noting that there are going to be at least 80 former political prisoners who are going to be members of parliament in the next term. I mean, this is miraculous. This is going to change. I mean, Naypyidaw is going to be a different place. No matter what happens, it is going to be a different place.
The government, the current government said that there is a release coming up?
No, the NLD.
The NLD.
The NLD
Okay.
has said this is a focus for them. And then the peace process with the ethnic nationalities. These have also been articulated as key priorities. And I think these are the right priorities for them to focus on going forward. A little bit about the U.S. and Burma and how the U.S. is going to be positioned in this transition. Obviously, the U.S. has supported democracy in Burma for many years, but in recent years, it has been a bit more problematic. The equities in the U.S. relationship with Burma have expanded to include a lot of other things, including economic issues, security issues that weren't really prominent in the relationship before. And it's been no secret in Rangoon that many of the Western diplomats, including the U.S. diplomats, were willing to accept a pretty bad election and see it as a, quote, step forward, that they had bought into many of these narratives of low expectations of the NLD, of low expectations of the Burmese people, and that they had spent a lot of the past 5 years cozying up to the powers that be, and that they expected the USDP to be a major player in, if not the government, in the future. And people in the NLD knew this, they were aware of this. Again, this was almost an open secret in Rangoon that this was how the Western powers were behaving. They had become very close to certain figures in the USDP. And despite a lot of positive rhetoric from the United States and insisting on a good, clean election and all of these things, the actions of U.S. diplomats had sent another message to people. And I think that this is going to have consequences going forward. Again, you know, the United States will still remain an important partner of Burma, but a level of mistrust and suspicion has crept into that relationship, I think, and it's going to be interesting to see how the United States, especially our diplomats, meet this challenge of this new democracy. At the same time, the NLD's landslide got people off the hook from having to deal with the consequences of much of their unfortunate behavior over the past 4 years, I will say this. The other thing that I want to talk about a little bit is about China, and I can talk more about this later. The Chinese have also pivoted in Burma. They have tried to be more clever about how they deal with the Burmese. They've engaged the opposition, they've engaged civil society, and they have serious equities up on the border and are playing very clever games in the peace process with the Kachin, not necessarily with the Kachin, but in the Kachin conflict, in the Kokang conflict, and the Shanxi conflicts. They are playing different sides, and they are much more nimble and clever about doing this than we could ever hope to be. This is their backyard. They know these people very well. They share ethnic ties with some of these groups. So we're quite kind of big-footed and awkward when we try to engage in some of these processes, and we have to be better if we hope to support a positive outcome up there. And I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. I was talking to someone the other day who was suggesting, actually, I think for good, by way of good evidence, that people on the ground, like yourself, seemed a lot more optimistic and hopeful than people in Washington. And so you come back so happy, and then people like me just throw a cold blanket on the whole thing. But it's good to hear that it's good to hear such optimism. And I know you have your reservations as well and your concerns going forward. But I don't know. It's just been so long since there's been much hope that it's a little bit. As I said at the outset, disorienting.
Yeah, I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience for a couple of days in Burma. It was really, being down at the NLD headquarters on Monday night was one of the highlights of my life, after my children and my marriage. Up there, it was tremendous to be part of that, and I thank God that I was able to be part of it. It really was. I'm a little glowy. It's a little over the top.
Well, I know that Jennifer shares my inclination toward gloom, so I'll turn it over to her with the hope that she's going to bring us back down to reality. But Jennifer Quigley is president of the U.S. Campaign for Burma. Prior to joining them, she worked for the Women's League of Burma and its member organization. She's been dedicated to this cause, like Kelly, for many years, and the three of us actually are partners and friends and collaborators on a lot of these issues. So it's really good to have you here, and I look forward to your remarks.
Unfortunately, Walter's right. Before I get to the gloom, though, just to give a bit of perspective of what this means, like what the process is for sort of next steps. So some of you followed this very closely and did thankfully inform me that there was a 9 p.m. results released, not just the 6 p.m. when they said that would be it for the day. Leave it to the UEC to change things up. Okay, so as of the latest results released by the UEC, the Union Election Commission, the NLD is two members shy of having the supermajority. And that's what they need. So I have this graphic that Tate and I did so that people can understand how you get from a parliamentary election to a presidential form of government. And so the way that the 2008 military constitution was written states that the elected members of the lower house, the elected members of the upper house, and the military bloc, they're 25% from the lower house and upper house, each of those three get to pick a vice president. So even before the latest results, the NLD had enough from the elected 2 blocks to nominate 2 vice presidents. So each of these 3 blocks nominates a vice president. So you have 3 vice presidents, and then the upper house and lower house together combined vote among those 3 candidates for the president. So for the NLD to have one of its vice presidential candidates be able to be the president, they would need 67% of the elected vote between the upper and lower house. So they only needed a simple majority to nominate a vice president, but they needed the 67% supermajority to know that one of their vice presidential candidates would absolutely become the president. Whereas the USDP had thought that they had rigged this election good enough where they would only have needed 34% of the electable seats to form the 26% they need with the military's 25% to have that simple majority between the 2 houses. So they failed miserably at their strategy. They're not going to come, I mean, technically now they will not reach that 34%. It's now physically impossible for the USDP to do that, whereas the NLD is one vote count away. So probably in tomorrow, well, tonight for us, but 9 a.m. tomorrow, which is...
They could still do an 11 p.m.
This is true, you know, like we could check our phones, you know, in an hour and see that they get their 2 seats. So we're very close to that, right? So you can understand Kelly's optimism because the odds were very heavily favored for the USDP, and the NLD managed to get the 67, well, they're very, very close to getting the 67% they need to ensure that one of their 2 nominees for vice president becomes the president, right? So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that there is, because of this 2008 Constitution that set up this rigged system, there are several things that an NLD government will have absolutely no control over. And this is why we sort of say, while you'll have a civilian government, you won't have a democracy. So first is that the Constitution guarantees autonomy and military control over all security forces in the country. The NLD will not control police, they will not control any type of security force, they will not control the military. And this is for 2 reasons. One, the military has utter and complete autonomy from civilian government. No authority, the civilian government has no authority over them, and they have no ability to hold them to account. They have actually no control over their budget. The second is that the military has the authority to appoint 3 ministers in the government. It's the Minister of Defense, Minister of Border Affairs, and the Minister of Home Affairs. Now, this last one is, to me, pretty key. The Minister of Home Affairs oversees the police force. So while many people will be hoping that whoever the NLD president is will pardon and grant amnesties to the political prisoners, the police and the Minister of Home Affairs can continue to arrest and imprison anybody they want. And so we will not see an end to the problem with political prisoners in Burma with an NLD government. You might be in a situation where you're seeing, you know, one day somebody's arrested and the next day Aung San Suu Kyi, well, whoever Aung San Suu Kyi has as president would have to pardon them. And so it becomes a very dicey situation. In addition to the Ministry of Home Affairs, there's the Ministry of Border Affairs. This controls all ethnic minority affairs, actually between the 2 ministries. And so you have a Ministry of Education in Burma, but that only actually applies to Burman areas of the country. The education for ethnic areas is under the Ministry of Border Affairs. General administration appointments for ethnic areas are under the Minister of Home Affairs appointments. And so, and general administration oversees most of what happens in ethnic areas. And so basically, the NLD will not be able to end the conflict. The military can continue to do what it wants. They will not be able to govern in any way, shape, or form anything that happens with the minorities in the country. The third way in which they're able to do this is that the Constitution legalized all military regime era laws, right? And this is a particular concern for 2 reasons that I feel stand out most is unlawful association. And so any attempts by the government to reach out to ethnic armed groups, to reach out to those affiliated with ethnic armed groups, it's considered an illegal act. And so the government itself could be in violation of that law. And so that's incredibly problematic for any efforts that the NLD tries to undertake at national reconciliation. The second is the 1982 citizenship law. For many of you know, the situation with the Rohingya is very dire. You have recent reports that basically call into question state sponsorship of genocide, right? And one of the key issues, in addition to the crimes happening against them, is that they have no legal status, that their citizenship was stripped from them by this 1982 citizenship law. Since this is a legalized military-era law, you'd have to change the Constitution if you want to grant citizenship for the Rohingya, if you want to address the citizenship issue for the Rohingya. And that's going to be quite problematic because the military has a veto power over changes to the Constitution, right? So I described all these issues of what the military has control over that is going to hamstring the NLD government, or hopeful NLD government. But they built in that they have their 25% of the seats in Parliament on both the national and on the state and region level, and you need more than 75% of the vote to change and amend the Constitution, which requires every single elected member as well as at least one member from the military bloc. So it's the military's veto. And so looking forward, the NLD has tremendous challenges ahead in addressing the systemic and structural human rights issues that the country faces. While these elections are taking place, while I hate to use the term nationwide ceasefire, it's what Thein Sein called it, you have ongoing attacks. 6,000 Shan people have been displaced in the last month. This is not an insignificant number when there's supposed to be a free and fair, like this euphoria over an election. There isn't much euphoria in Shan State right now. There isn't much euphoria in Kachin State. And this is something that the NLD will want to address, but will be hamstrung to do so. And this is, to me, where the U.S. comes in the international community. The U.S. is one of the few countries, actually, that has any type of leverage left. And I've been trying to caution the administration to not use that leverage to reward any type of, yay, they allowed the NLD to have, to receive these votes. They didn't rig the election so extensively like they did in 2010. Or that they reward when they agree to have the NLD sit in Parliament, that they agree that when the NLD forms this new government. So that's not until February. The new Parliament doesn't take office until February, and the new government would take office in March. And so, in my opinion, that is not a significant enough event to warrant the U.S. increasing its trade relationship, increasing its military relationship, because we moved way too prematurely on some of the sanctions we already had that were lifted after Aung San Suu Kyi got a seat during the by-election. So I'm like, you rewarded 5%. NLD got 5% of Parliament, and we lifted all of our economic sanctions, which to me was the stupidest move this administration has made yet on Burma policy. But it leaves in this situation right now that we have, that if you reward the NLD forming the government, what is left to try and get the military to agree to constitutional change? What is left to address the Rohingya situation? What is left? You don't have leverage. And the NLD will want to do these things, and they will need its international partners to achieve that, because their domestic leverage was just achieved. That the will of the people is for democracy. The will of the people is for an NLD government. That was what they signaled. They didn't signal, it doesn't signal that there's democracy in Burma. It signals that the people in Burma want it. And we should do everything we can to ensure that that is not something that is reserved for those in territories that are not under conflict, that's not reserved for everybody except for the Rohingya. And so it'll be important that these military-controlled structural issues are addressed and are primary for the U.S.-Burma relationship going forward. So yeah, that's my splash of cold water.
All of which I agree with.
I suppose that the pitch to Congress, if it's going now, or if it's in the offing, especially on the military side, will be that, in order to induce the military to come to agreement to make the sort of compromises that are necessary between now and March, we should expand the amount of, give them some goodies, basically, to encourage it. How do you respond to that?
For me, what I've seen is when the U.S. over the past 4 years has gone first, we've seen negative results in response. After Obama was in Burma, which came after the lifting of sanctions, and he lifted the import ban days before he went, but 10 days later they were using white phosphorus to attack monks and peaceful protesters at a copper mine. This regime has become more emboldened to just do what it wants once pressure is lifted. And so when I talk about sequencing, the issue is they need to come first, and we need to come second. We've tried the other way around, and it hasn't worked for those who are suffering from human rights abuses in the country.
And I would add that if the military hasn't gotten it by now, how much the people in the country hate being governed by them, then, I'm not sure that there's anything outsiders can do to convince them.
Mm-hmm.
This is now the third election, if you include the by-election, where the NLD won 43 out of 44 seats, and they only lost the other seat because they didn't have a candidate there, where they have just flat out repudiated military rule. Every opportunity they get, the Burmese people, including in the ethnic areas where they are able to, have just flat out repudiated it. And I know that within the military's self-conception, they believe they are the only ones who can save the country, and they have this rejection of the competence of civilian authorities, and this gets further fed by again, my favorite experts who say things like, oh, but can the NLD govern? They're inexperienced. And as Dasu said the other day in her press conference, we could hardly do worse. I mean, this is a military that's run this country into the ground, one of the richest, most amazing countries you could imagine. So if they don't start to get it and change themselves, I mean, what you saw in Indonesia, and you and I have been working on some of these things for a long time, the Indonesian military took themselves out of the game because they recognized they just were terrible at governing the country. They were not good at making economic decisions. They were not good at politics. Militaries generally are not. And, I think I'm hoping, hoping against experience in many ways, but hoping that the military will that at least some people within the military will start to see that this means that they do need to step back. And that they won't have to necessarily be forced by events to do so, but that they will start to pull themselves back and really engage in cooperation. That would be an ideal outcome here.
All right. Let me turn it now to Olivia Enos. Olivia is Research Associate here at the Asian Studies Center at Heritage Foundation. She's also co-founder of something called the Council on Asian Affairs, which is an initiative she started on her own, actually with no affiliation to Heritage, but it's a collection, a networking group of young scholars, officials, analysts, Hill staff, that sort of thing, that are very interested in Asia. And it's a pretty exciting initiative she's undertaken with another of her colleagues here. She follows for us issues of human rights, human trafficking, transborder type of human rights issues generally, including crime. And she's been very focused on the Burma issue for us over the last couple of years. So let me turn it over to Olivia to give us some perspective.
Thank you. So as both Jen and Kelly indicated, Burma's 2015 elections are incredibly historic, and I don't think that anyone predicted the outcome, especially such a significant victory for the NLD. It's unquestionably worth celebrating, but I appreciate how one article that I read characterized it. They said that Burma's elections were democratic, but with an asterisk. And the asterisk that they described was basically identifying the continued military control that will occur unquestionably in Burma. And I would add just a couple more asterisks onto that by saying, obviously the military is one of the asterisks, but also exclusion from the voting process. Some people have suggested that as much as 20% of the population, or 10 million people, were not able to vote in this last election. And finally, you have constitutional language that bars Aung San Suu Kyi from becoming president, which is also inherently exclusionary. And of course, as Jen mentioned, you have the ongoing persecution and discrimination against the Rohingya. And all of this makes for what Aung San Suu Kyi herself characterizes as not fair, but largely free election. And going into this election, the U.S. government wasn't even asking Burma to hold free and fair elections. In fact, they shifted the language on this and said, we need to see elections that are credible, inclusive, and transparent. And Burma didn't even meet this standard. Credible, possibly. Transparent, I think it's looking pretty good so far, with a major caveat of the advanced voting and counting of votes in the ethnic area. And then inclusive, Burma didn't even meet that before Election Day, and we knew that pretty clearly. But Burma really should have been held to the same standard that we hold other countries to. It should have been expected that it would hold a free and fair election for it to be successful. So prior to the elections, I wrote a paper that looked at USAID's standards for what a free and fair election looks like, and you guys should have received that today. And they lay out 10 pretty clear standards So what I want to do first is go through those 10 standards, kind of look at how the elections so far have met those standards or not met those standards, and then look at some of the challenges and also opportunities that the new government will have going forward. So the first benchmark that USAID gives is that of an impartial electoral framework. Going into this, we knew that it wasn't an impartial electoral framework. As I mentioned before, the Constitution bars Aung San Suu Kyi from holding office, so we can pretty clearly say that that was not met. The second one is that of a credible electoral administration. As I mentioned, conflict has already arisen regarding the tallying of the advanced votes. And so that calls into question some of the Union Election Commission's oversight on those issues. And this is not unprecedented, as we saw in 2010. UEC played a really big role in rigging the vote with advanced votes, so we should watch carefully for that. Three, USAID asked for effective oversight of electoral processes. I would say on this point, we actually saw some improvements in Burma, inviting the Carter Center out. International Republican Institute was there. I believe the EU also had some electoral observers.
The biggest one, actually.
And there have been some pretty good reports saying that access was generally granted to these organizations, so I think that was generally a fairly positive thing. Number 4 was to have informed and active citizens. Unquestionably, in Burma, you had an active citizenry. Reports say roughly 80% voter turnout. But recent studies conducted by the Asia Foundation found that actual knowledge of the electoral process and of how the government works is pretty low. I think they even said that 82% of the 3,000 people surveyed could not even name a single branch of government, so that's an area for potential improvement for future elections. Number 5 is a representative and competitive multi-party system. You had 110 parties contesting in the Burmese election. However, the Burmese constitution does kind of unfairly go against NLD by not allowing their main candidate to be president, and so maybe not quite as competitive or fair, but still fairly decent. Number 6, effective government by elected leaders and bodies. I think so far so good, but the track record with USDP is not good, so I think this sort of remains to be seen. Number 7 is a really big one, inclusion of women and disadvantaged groups. Like I said, we knew before the election started that these disadvantaged groups would not be included, and the Carter Center mentioned in their report that there were not very many female candidates that were running, and so that was something maybe that could be improved in the future. Number 8, effective transfer of political power. I also think this is pretty essential and this will play out over the next several months as we see whether or not there is actually a peaceful transfer of power. While USDP officials have said that it will go forward and the military has said it will go forward, I think this in particular is where the international community needs to watch really closely. Number 9 is consensus building for democratic reform. Burma has undergone significant political transformation, and politicians have verbally expressed their commitment to democratic reform, but I think we've seen passage of discriminatory race and religion laws prior to the elections, the government's continued intransigence on constitutional reform, and ongoing persecution of Rohingya that to some extent undermines that consensus. The final one is sustainable local engagement. I think this was a pretty positive element, especially by the NLD. They really engaged quite a lot. So now that we've seen kind of where Burma matches up to USAID's standards, I want to kind of talk about what the true test of democracy is, because the true test of democracy is not whether a country can hold peaceful elections. It's really whether or not once people leave the polling station, they're guaranteed those basic democratic freedoms and rights going forward. And I think that that's where we see both constraints and opportunities for the new government going forward. So the first constraint I identify is the continued military control, which Jen discussed in great detail, so I don't want to really dwell on this for too long. But I think one of the big challenges will be, how can the NLD work within the existing structure with the military and the type of obstructions that could could potentially be faced there. But I think, we'll have to watch this very closely, particularly when it comes to implementing constitutional reforms. But I think that there are three really great opportunities. One is the NLD's ability to deliver on basic democratic freedoms. So I think they're going to face a really great period of benevolence here if they actually are able to take power. And I think with that will come fairly high expectations that they deliver. But as Jen said, there are certain inherent obstructions in the system that are going to take years to move forward on. And so I think we have to kind of temper our expectations and support positive forward movement, but definitely hope to see future democratic freedoms. Two, I would encourage the new government to press for greater economic freedom in Burma, particularly because when you have greater economic freedom, a lot of those basic human rights and democratic freedoms will usually come alongside. Heritage's Index of Economic Freedom lists Burma as the 161st freest country in the world. That's out of 189 surveyed. While we've seen a huge increase in the amount of economic reform that Burma has experienced over the past several years, this is still really, really low, and there's a lot of forward movement that needs to happen. So the new government should press for freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and ensure that these freedoms are guaranteed, but obviously recognize that this may happen at a slower pace than we'd like. My third and final opportunity is to address the situation facing Rohingya. This is an incredibly terrible situation. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has indicated that there are early warning signs of genocide. We've actually met with a Rohingya young woman who said that if you go to the camps, it's just horrible conditions, no access to food, limited access to health care and schooling for children. These people are completely disenfranchised. So not only did they have the right to vote taken away from them, their basic livelihood is being threatened right now. So this is something that there's a potential opportunity now that we don't have the politics of the elections kind of throwing a wrench in plans to improve the situation with the Rohingya. So there could be positive movement forward. So I would just conclude by saying that while this election is worth congratulating Burma on, there obviously are some clear issues that we have to work on going forward and clear challenges that Burma will face. And the U.S. should come alongside Burma to help encourage those democratic reforms, but also be careful, as Jen said, not to give up important leverage that makes sure that that democratic reform process stays on track. And with that, we conclude.
Great, thank you, Olivia. I'm going to open it up to questions here, and thankfully we have a good amount of time for questions. But before I do, while you think about what you most want to get at, I wanted to ask a very big question of maybe all three of you. The whole issue of standards, free and fair, or credible, transparent, and inclusive, becomes a little bit of a issue, or seems to become less important when another part of what the administration has been referencing, the will of the Burmese people, has so clearly been demonstrated. So what is the role of these standards, and what difference does it make how you characterize them when the people who ought to have won the election won the election? I mean, they ought to have won it. They ought to have won it by virtue of their popularity and the number of votes that were cast. In a lot of countries, you have, much less dire circumstances. But say the Philippines, if a candidate wins the presidency with less than 2 million votes, it's a problem, right? Because there's so much room there for corruption and other things. But they have to win with over 2 million or so just to deal with that fudge issue. So is that the case here, where they have won by such overwhelming amount that whatever standards we use doesn't really matter anymore?
I would say that is the de facto case. I mean, yes, the NLD has swept these elections and won by such a huge majority that there were a number of scenarios that people laid out, and on the one extreme was an NLD landslide that got over the 67% threshold, cleared it by a good majority, and then on the other was that they got obliterated. and either one of those scenarios was fairly clear cut. It was the middle, these standards are set up more to deal with the more gray situations where fraud is the margin of difference in an election. Here, the NLD overcame the fraud margin of difference. As you point out, in the Philippines, it's 2 million. I don't, in Burma, it was the 67%. And so, I mean, as somebody who's worked in this, election monitoring field over the years and seen the evolution of these standards and the movement away from this kind of free and fair terminology toward more nuanced, credible, standards of credibility, I think that there are good and bad elements to how the election monitoring, how it's been professionalized and how the standards have evolved and developed. But I think that in a situation like this, very clearly, they overcame the fraud margin of error. But as we've all said, I think that the problem is that because the NLD does need such a huge majority to effectively govern, and it's going to be very difficult for all the reasons that John laid out with the Constitution, as well as the beyond what ministries the military will directly control going forward. You have to remember that key personnel in every ministry, whether it's education, health, everything, were replaced. Professional civil servants over the past 25 years have been replaced by military hacks, people who were being demobilized or whatever, were even still in uniform up until 5 years ago, running ministries where they had no technical expertise, and they were running them as military people. So you still have to go back and deal with these kind of administrative problems that are going to be tremendous. So I think that anyway, focusing on the key question though about the election standards, they are incredibly important when in a Cambodia situation where it's more contested. But in a situation like this, like I said, it gets everybody off the hook in a way from having to worry about some of these problems. It doesn't make them go away or any less real for the people who experienced them, such as the disenfranchisement. And it does, and those problems will carry forward. They will have consequences down the road if they are not addressed in between now and the next elections. So it is important not to ignore the fact that just because the NLD won, that these problems exist and do have to be dealt with, because it may not be the situation next time.
So the outcome of the election doesn't mean that these standards are important, or the way that we define them is not important going forward.
Right.
It's just the sort of the way this election turned out made them in the immediate term less relevant.
No, like I said, they got everybody off the hook.
Right.
Oh, sorry. I also think it's important insofar as it sort of indicates at what level Burma is in its democratic transition. I mean, the fact that not all of these things happen and they should have happened is a sign that Burma still has quite a lot of work to do. And so I see it almost as forecasting some of the future of the bumps along the way that I think we are going to face in the overall democratization process.
Yeah, the standards to me, they should be pushed everywhere. And while we're all sort of breathing a sigh of relief that we had this party that we do consider sort of true Democrats, and we'll be happy to sort of see them at the government and happy that people voted strategically for that reason. But the disadvantaged groups, the Muslims in particular, which we really didn't get into, is extremely worrying. And if you lower the standard after the election is over, those problems are going to persist and could potentially get worse. And so you're putting off problems by not adhering to that type of standard. And we will see that going forward. And there should be pressure on the NLD to be more inclusive of the disenfranchised communities, the Muslims, as well as the other ethnic minorities who voted for them strategically, and will be looking to ensure that the NLD is much more inclusive of those minorities.
Let me open it up. Okay. Right now, Mike Martin.
Hi, Mike Martin, Congressional
Got a.
Research. We've got a microphone. Michael Martin, Congressional Research Service. Jen, I'd like to pick up on that last comment. The ethnic parties did not do well in much of the country. and the panel's given some explanations on why so. Could you speak a little bit about moving ahead? NLD also didn't reach out to the ethnic parties, although they had a lot of ethnic candidates on their slate. Could you speak a little bit about the NLD's relations with the ethnic parties, the ethnic organizations, particularly the ethnic armed groups, and within that, the Muslim community? Because right now, the current forecast, there'll be no Muslims in the parliament, which is a significant portion of the population.
I'll start. Well, I do want to say something that I didn't mention before, is that another thing that this election to me symbolized was a rejection of the Mabata ethno-nationalist, racist manipulation of religion for political reasons, which was, I think, something that the USDP was really counting on to help push them forward, and it utterly failed. And I don't believe that that's because the Burmese people and especially the Buddhist Burman populations are less racist than we think they are. I do believe actually that the racism towards Muslims and in particular toward the Rohingya is quite deep-seated. But again, going back to kind of at the end of the day, they hate the regime more than they dislike the Muslims. And they can live with Muslims, but they decided we can't live with this regime anymore. So that doesn't mean that the problem is gone, and as Jen says, it has to continue to be addressed. I think there have been some positive remarks in the past day or two by Aung San Suu Kyi herself, talking about the need to protect minority rights and to respect and to do things. She's become, I think, more forward-leaning in the post-election period, but I think it's important to note that the Mabata narrative was a big loser here as well, and the extremism that it carried with it also, and so I think that's a fairly positive outcome here. As to the relations with the ethnic parties, it was very interesting. I can talk about what happened in Chin State. There were 11 Chin parties running in Chin State, which is a lot. You have a first-past-the-post system. So again, people voted strategically. They may have liked their Chin parties and may have, if they thought that it would make a difference, would have voted for them, but they knew it wouldn't. And they didn't want to, when they get in the polling place, they just decide, I'm not going to waste my vote on a Chin party. I'm going to vote with the NLD. They're going to win, and I want to make sure. At the same time, the NLD engaged in pretty scorched earth behavior towards these parties, I have to say, on the ground in Chin State. I can't speak for other places, but it was a rough campaign in Chin State, very personal attacks on the Chin candidates from the Chin parties. The candidates that the NLD fielded were ethnic Chin themselves, and they need to do some healing. And I talked to my NLD friends. I talked to my NLD friends in Chin State as well as in headquarters about how important it is going to be to reach out to these people and bring them into the fold. It is a critical thing. And it would be, I think, a really important thing for the NLD to do in terms of one of their vice presidential selections, even, their presidential selection, to choose an ethnic leader who is well respected and has a good history of cooperation with the NLD. Several names have been floated, and nominate that person to ensure that there does continue to be an ethnic vice president. There was one under the USDP, and there has actually historically been one. And that would be a really, really important thing for the NLD to do. And I hope that they will, and there are indications that they plan to do this, and that that's been the message from Dasu and from the party leadership since the elections. On the ground, it's going to be hard. I mean, there's a lot of hurt feelings and a lot of bitterness, at least what I saw. But I think that there was a recognition, even among many of the ethnic parties, that these are votes of protest and resistance, and that's what was going on, and it wasn't personal in a sense.
So 2 points. One is that in addition to people voting strategically for the NLD in ethnic areas, there was actually also places where USDP did well because there are so many ethnic minority parties that they split their vote. So particularly in Shan State, the SNDP and the SNLD split the vote. And if you looked at the combined votes in each constituency, if you put the SNDP and the SNLD together, they would have won. So in some of the cases, they actually handicapped themselves. And USDP got seats they actually wouldn't have otherwise gotten. So the numbers of USDP are not necessarily all based on military votes. They're also based on ethnic parties splitting their votes. And so there's some healing that needs to take place within ethnic groups. In addition, to be honest, the biggest thing I think that the NLD is going to have to confront going forward, and it's a message that everybody should send, is that they're not there to be a benevolent government over the ethnic minorities. This is not, I've heard this before, we won't treat you as badly as the USDP, we won't treat you as, no, they deserve representation, not benevolence. And so in her speeches so far, Asuci was like, well, I'll protect the Muslims. While that's great, that's insignificant in what is necessary to heal the wounds that the NLD has created with their scorched earth policy. And they received this vote of confidence from the ethnic minorities, but they will all say that this was not for them to be a benevolent government that just treats them better than the military USDP did, but that they actually do incorporate them into ministerial posts, that there is reform, in the limited sense that they can, reform of laws that will help the ethnics in increasing the level of representation they have in government. So for instance, the president appoints the chief ministers, which is our form of governor, for the states and the regions. And so you have 7 states. And so that means that the NLD president will appoint them. You should, for Kachin State, be appointing a Kachin chief minister. For Karen State, they should be appointing a Karen minister, and so they should go the step beyond what they are sometimes viewed as just trying to be the benevolent government.
I would even go further than that and make it a top priority in terms of constitutional reform. And this is something where they should be able to get the military to go along with it, to amend Article 261 of the Constitution, which gives the president the authority to appoint state ministers. I mean, this was actually something that was attempted this past summer, was to try to amend this section of the Constitution and to make it where the state and regional parliaments will instead vote for and select those chief ministers. And doing that, I think, fighting for that up front, yes, do by all means be very inclusive when you're doing the appointments initially, but if you make a priority initially to fight for that kind of constitutional reform, instead of putting some of the more, NLD specific reforms front and center, doing something like this could go a long way towards reconciliation as well.
Right here in the center.
Hi, my name is Colby Ferlin at the East-West Center. I wanted to ask a question about Myanmar in the context of U.S. influence in the region. Not to play devil's advocate, but the United States isn't a big economic partner with Myanmar right now in comparison to the rest of East Asian countries. So China is the big trade and investment partner, Japan, development assistance. Other neighboring countries have big strategic interest in Myanmar. China is the conduit to Bay of Bengal, Southeast Asia, Northern Economic Corridor, India, corridor to Southeast Asia. So I totally understand the points about, well, they don't meet X out of 10 indicators, and so the U.S. needs to be careful with how we manage our leverage over them. So would that be like, well, reinstate sanctions or restrict diplomatic ties? The question is not, do we back a government no matter what, just so we can have influence, but what kind of programs can we do? What's the room for the U.S. to become involved in the region so we maintain influence with Myanmar, even if things start to go south?
This is a good question. So, what I think people sort of think when they look at GDP and how much is there China versus U.S. The U.S. is the untapped frontier to that. Like, we look at Burma as an untapped frontier, they look at the U.S. as an untapped frontier. So it's like they sort of look at themselves as not wanting to become more of a satellite state of China economically, not just politically, but economically. They want the U.S. market. So for instance, one thing that the U.S. has not done yet is reinstate Burma in the GSP program. It's a huge opportunity to sort of, they want that. They've already been accepted into Europe's GSP. Right? And so when they're looking at their economic frontiers and opportunities for them, we're it. And so that gives the United States economic leverage. And so you say, okay, you want this, you want these 5,000 product categories that you can import to the U.S. duty-free to increase your economy. These are the standards that we expect to see from you if you want that relationship. And so most people look at it as like, well, the U.S. is not the big economic player in the country, and you sort of have to look externally and look at, well, but that's exactly why we do have the leverage, is that they want to increase the relationship. They're greedy. They're very greedy. The two largest companies in the country are military-run companies, right? And so if you want economic reform in Burma, and you want to strengthen the economic relationship between U.S. and Burma, which is what they want to do, we then have that opportunity. It gives us a bit of an upper hand that people don't realize that we have.
I would agree with Jen 100%. I would also say that, sometimes quality is more important than quantity here as well. We represent a higher quality of investment in many cases, and they are very interested to have U.S. management, U.S. corporations that uphold higher standards than some of the Asian partners that have come in and dominated the market. I would also say that, part of the problem since the sanctions, most of the economic sanctions were lifted in Burma, it's not like U.S. company, they did kind of rush in and look around and then like, oh, we can't do business here, there's not a functioning banking system, the currency is incredibly unstable, we can't even rent property here at a reasonable rate. There are all these barriers to entry that have nothing to do with our sanctions. And that is largely what has kept a damper on U.S. investment. Likewise, though, our sanctions do have an important consequence because they keep our companies from doing business with extremely nasty people. People who are on the SDN list are not on there for cheating at tiddlywinks. These are bad people. The problem with the port in Rangoon that has cut U.S. trade to Burma in half, the guy that owns it is one of the biggest drug dealers in the world. In the world, not in Burma, in the world. He has been on every U.S. list. He's a bad guy, and he owns the major port in Rangoon that's why our banks won't extend credit to companies that are exporting into that port. This is a problem for Burma's economy. It's not a problem for us. We can go elsewhere. It's a problem for Burma's economy, and it's a problem of governance as well. The USDP is the party of these cronies, and it has done business with these people and benefited them and benefited from them for decades. And the NLD has got to find a way through, I think, expanded economic freedom, through restructuring the economy, and in some cases saying, people need to go to jail because they are committing economic crimes, and their empires need to maybe be broken up a little bit. Use the authority of the regulatory power of the state not to repress business and make it impossible for people to open small businesses and do business in Burma, but rather to actually regulate the economy and deal with some of these extremely bad actors who dominate it now. And yes, this is going to terrify people in the military because they benefit extremely from it. And this cozy relationship between Burma's oligarchs and cronies in the military is one of is part of the iron triangle that keeps the Burmese military in power. And the NLD, if they want to be successful economically for the country, they're going to have to go after it. They're going to have to be very clever and careful about the way they do it, but they eventually are going to have to go after it. And as U.S. businesses going in there, yeah, some people are going to invest in this place no matter what. The oil and gas sector will go and do business with the Burmese, with Moji, with the state-run oil and gas. But, we always do these things with kind of a short-term mentality and don't really think about the long-term consequences. If you look at what's happened in Burma and how the Burmese people view Chinese investment in their country and how negatively their attitude has developed toward the kind of investment that the Chinese have done in their country, they don't want that low-quality, extractive investment. They are fighting against it. And if we go in and try to do the same kind of thing, they're going to turn on us quickly too.
Did you have anything to add?
I guess I would just say one thing. In bringing up the 10 ways to gauge a free and fair election, I wasn't intending it to be like, oh, and if they don't meet these, we should place a ton of sanctions on them. I think what I was trying to say is that we shouldn't celebrate this as 100% a victory. There are still meaningful steps that need to be taken in Burma for full democratization to be realized. And so, as Jen said, U.S. is kind of the last country that still has leverage over Burma, and we don't want to be too quick to just give up that leverage entirely. So I guess that would be my...
Yeah, it really is a good question, because I think it gets at why the Burmese government was reaching out to the United States in the first place, what they thought they were going to get out of it. My gut feeling on it is a little bit different than Jen's maybe on the econ side. I think like a lot of countries in the region, they could do without a lot of U.S. engagement, do quite well. The ruling class and the generals and everyone else there could do quite well, and as a country, they could do all right. I mean, the U.S. just doesn't have the economic leverage that we once had. The region can get along decently without us, in fact, which is so important why we stay engaged there, because that has changed over the last, whatever number you want to put on it, but 10, 15 years, in a way that has not been fully absorbed. I think in Washington, we're still thinking in terms of sort of the unipolar moment and what we were in the Cold War and that sort of thing in the minds of everyone in the region. But I think we still have leverage on the big geopolitical picture. Whoever's in power, I mean, that theory has been out there that the generals basically were interested in engaging the U.S. because we're the only power that has any prospect of balancing the Chinese in any way, kind of helping them distance themselves a little bit. There's a lot of people have theorized that they, and actually spoken to officials there who have told them that they wanted to get a little distance, that they've been getting uncomfortably close to the Chinese. And as much as everyone talks about India, India just is not a big enough player in Burma to provide that kind of leverage. I think going forward, what's going to be interesting in terms of leverage, and it's going to be a challenge to a lot of geopolitical thinkers, people who think in very realist terms, is that the U.S. has a special tie to what will be the new leaders in Burma, to the NLD. And so does an NLD-led Burma still behave as the previous one and still driven by the same sort of motivations and that sort of thing? I don't think so. And so a lot of people who think in grand geopolitical terms vis-a-vis China and everyone else is going to have to rethink the way international relations actually work. And maybe the fact that we were the leading voice for Aung San Suu Kyi for the last 25 years and never abandoned her, maybe that gains us some goodwill that actually has real benefit going forward. And so the need for leverage going forward may not be as great as it was under the previous government.
Not with the government, but with the military.
Yes, right. Right. Garrett. Well, this guy, and then I'll come to you.
Also.
So I'm also former NLD, or just for Kelly Kerry. What do you think about the Union Peace Central Committee led by ruling government and the Myanmar Peace Center, their role in the future of Burma in the peace process?
It's probably not appropriate to say what I really think in polite conversation since we're on the record. So Uong Men, who was the head of the government's peace process team, lost his seat in parliament. And the Myanmar Peace Center, which many people in Burma viewed as a collaborationist operation of many of the staff are former activists and people who were part of the 88 generation and part of the democracy movement, who then went to work for the government on their peace process. And I think, you've seen, I don't know what's going to happen to the Myanmar Peace Center and the infrastructure that it has built for itself and its staff in the new government. I'm curious, I think there's going to be some serious scrambling. I understand that there's already been lots of outreach to people that previously couldn't get their phone calls returned by certain individuals at the Myanmar Peace Center. So, I try to keep my schadenfreude in check when I deal with this issue. The ethnics, there's no love lost, even with the ones who signed the nationwide ceasefire agreement, so-called nationwide ceasefire agreement. There's no love lost between them and the Myanmar Peace Center. They'll deal with the NLD. They'll be happy to deal with the NLD. Is there something there worth saving from the institution itself? I don't know. Maybe that's up for the NLD to decide in the future government. And I think that I think it was that the ethnic nationalities, especially the ethnic armed groups, there's a lot of questions about whether the NLD can do a better job than the USDP, bring the generals along. Again, I think that the potential for greater trust and confidence is there. They're just, apropos of, I'm not really sure what, suddenly after the NLD victory, pictures of Zipporah Sane, the head of the Karen National Union, with Dasu started popping up on my Facebook feed. I'm sure you saw the same thing. And I think that there's a real, the Karen in particular, the Kachin, the Shan, these are the main ethnic nationalities, the largest ones, and they have a long history of wanting to work with the NLD and wanting and some fairly deep ties over time that have developed. And I feel like you'll see a bit more of a shift where the ethnics will be, it'll be more of an ethnic and NLD alliance with get lined up against the military. Whether that makes the military feel more cornered or feel like they have to give up more is, it's hard to say going forward. But, I remember also a year ago, a friend of mine in Burma saying, these Myanmar Peace Center guys, they're, so whatever, they could end up in jail in a couple years, so I wouldn't worry about them. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. They're like, you just never know what's going to happen. So I'll leave it at that.
There's one point I would like to say about, because it brings up the issue of the Peace Support Fund. And so when this idea of these talks and this process came about, the Norwegians and a couple of the other Europeans and the Japanese to an extent were heavily funding these programs, and the ethnic groups absolutely reviled the Myanmar Peace Center, and this is where most of the money was funneled. And so the U.S. was rightly cautious in not putting its money into it. But now that there's been sort of a nationwide ceasefire agreement signed, the U.S. is going to be involved in the Peace Support Fund and putting money into it. And there's still a lot of questions as to the makeup, right? Particularly the decision-making makeup of this Peace Support Fund.
And the mechanism.
And the mechanism.
Funds will go through.
Yeah, and so, I couldn't emphasize enough how much civil society, ethnic civil society, women's groups need to be part of that mechanism, need to be part of that decision-making. One of the biggest frustrations that I keep voicing over this peace process that's taken place is the exclusion of civil society, is the exclusion of the impacted communities. It has become a very top-down process. It has not seen any dividends on the ground. And this, in my opinion, is very much to the fault of the exclusion of ethnic civil society organizations, and particularly the women's groups. And that's something that the U.S. must push for in any future endeavors, which the U.S. has already said that we will be part of and we will be funding.
Hi, my name is Gerrit van der Wees, editor of Taiwan Communique. Thanks very much for the great presentations and the insights, and congratulations on this momentous result. Really the work of many years of hard work on your side. We hope that we can replicate such a result in Taiwan in January, on January 16th, and hope we have a similar landslide over there. My question is as follows. I want to look across the borders a little bit. Last weekend, there was a meeting in Singapore between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou, and many people dubbed this a historic meeting, and I don't quite agree with that characterization. But I do think that a meeting in the future between Aung San Suu Kyi and Taiwan's democratic leader, Tsai Ing-wen, when she becomes president, that would be really truly historic to women in Asia who have worked for democracy. So can you comment on the significance of such a possible meeting?
It would be significant. I don't know. Like I said before, the Chinese have been very clever about how they've engaged the NLD. They invited Aung San Suu Kyi to China and gave her head of state level treatment. And the NLD has also, at the regular member level, their members of parliament have been invited on study tours, and the Chinese have really gone heavy with the political influence operations on the civil society in Burma and on the media, as well as the NLD. And so I think that also Aung San Suu Kyi herself has made statements that, China's our neighbor, we're not going to pick the country up and move it somewhere else, we have a long border here, we have to deal with them. And the Chinese are playing a lot of games with the ethnic nationalities that are in conflict with the military, and on multiple levels, as I mentioned before. So the Burmese have to deal with China. It's a fact of life. They have to have a relationship there. I think, going back to kind of what Walter was saying, I expect that we'll see a fairly kind of Indonesian evolution where even though the United States, maybe not as forcefully supported democracy in Indonesia, we did somewhat support it, at least Congress did anyway, from time to time. It didn't cause, at least for the most part, the Indonesians to come rushing into the arms of the United States. The Burmese will pursue an independent foreign policy, whether that means that they will do things like have a meeting with Tsai Ing-wen, I cannot say, but they will pursue an independent foreign policy.
That is really a uncomfortable question in a way, because one would think that an NLD government would still maintain some sort of, commitment to principle.
Yeah.
And in this case, the NLD and DPP, I believe, are all in the same international union of sort of center-left parties.
Yes.
So they're familiar with each other. A lot of Taiwanese DPP figures are very sympathetic to the NLD and have been for years.
And there has been a lot of party-to-party contact.
Yeah,
I will say, I know that there were a number of different Taiwanese organizations working in Burma, doing training and doing different kinds of activities. So
the question would be then, why not?
Oh, I know why not.
I think I kind of alluded to it.
But why not? But then the why not becomes, a calculation that is not that becoming of Aung San Suu Kyi.
But this is actually the one criticism I will give her. I sort of try and avoid it because the military is just so much worse than her. But she said that she's a politician. She's not a human rights person. She's not a democracy activist. She is a politician who's trying, to rule Burma. She doesn't speak out on behalf of democratic efforts or human rights efforts anywhere. The Nobel Women's Initiative, campaigned for her for years, and she won't get involved in things that are not Burma. She won't get involved in in considering the China question. She's not going to do the principled thing. She's going to do the strategic thing. She's a strategic person. And so we look at her as principled, but if there is a conflict between being strategic and being principled, she picks strategic. And so I think that is going to be problematic going forward.
Too, I should say that I know Tsai Ing-wen is, 20% are still ahead in the polls or so, but even a KMT government, I think, would have some interest, especially having breached this. I mean, they made a little bit of progress, I think, just in having Ma Ying-jeou go to Singapore as the president of Taiwan. So, I mean, in Singapore, they could call him whatever they wanted to. He was the president of Singapore, and he didn't sneak in. He was really there. And so, if you look around the region at other targets, even if you're the KMT, I think maybe you consider this one as a potential target.
And I just to further to that, I know that's not the topic of today's briefing, but Singapore's not the only government, and there are other governments in the region that are looking for subtle ways to push back on what they see as very heavy-handed behavior. And so any Taiwanese government needs to be really looking at how they, and I know that the Taiwanese are quite engaged in the region and try, mostly economically, but expanding that and doing some of the things that did happen in Burma with some of the party-to-party contacts and, participating in things like in Community of Democracies and World Movement of Democracies that gives you opportunity to meet with people and establish those relationships are really important.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The Heritage Foundation, Taiwan can always come up. Whatever the topic, somehow Taiwan always comes up.
Sounds
Yeah.
like my office.
My name is Muhammad Asmul Karim. I was neighbor of Burma, Bangladesh. I am observing Burma from 1965. I think the main problem is army structure and institution. Like Russia, their manpower is one military person by 100 people, as just Russia. So the immediate future of Burma's democracy depends on reforming army structure and institution. I agree with Jennifer. But is it possible to reform this? At least cut down the manpower hub and reform it, decentralize the power. Like as USA, 1,000 people is 6.5 now army strength, but it is organized with a check and balance. So I think it's like, because I work in Bangladesh earlier there is a coup, but my thought successfully reformed the army into 9 regional cantonment. So now it is self-check and balance, coming to check and balance. You need this type of reform in Burma. What
Okay.
is your
Yeah, what do you think about reform in the military?
Yeah, well, we're talking about decentralization of both power and resources in the country, which is a huge aspect of what needs to be done. It's the next stage of reform, once you get past kind of the top-line political issues that we've been dealing with through the election. And again, as I said before, Article 261 of the Constitution, giving more power back to the state and regional parliaments, which also the NLD just killed it in these state and regional parliaments. I mean, they won huge, but the military still has 25% of the seats, even at the state and regional parliament level. So if they can start to do some things at the state and regional parliaments, it could be really beneficial. I think the other thing that the NLD should focus on, again, I think it would be a tremendous benefit to the economy of Burma if there were greater decentralization and allowed, and especially on the issue of revenue sharing, this is going to be essential to the peace process moving forward. The Constitution has some schedules that have not yet been implemented. Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 5 all deal with decentralization of power and decentralization of revenues. Right now, anything that's sort of legally or illegally extracted kind of goes to the center, and the economy is very top-down and very, very hierarchical. If you can release some of that and give some of the regional and state governments the ability to do more. I mean, for instance, Chen State could be a tourism mecca. I mean, the place is just stunning. I've never been anywhere more beautiful. I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous. But there's no tourist infrastructure up there. It's impossible to get to the prettiest parts of the country. It's just like, there's so much more that could be done. And allowing political power, again, this is a legacy of military rule, that everything is top down and centralized, but getting political power back down to the grassroots through some of these parliaments that are going to hopefully be more effective with more democratic representation in them, and addressing the revenue sharing issues, and dealing with some of these things will be hugely important for the NLD to tackle in the next 5 years. And they have huge economic benefits, could really unleash some growth there, and could also help to heal some of these wounds and empower the ethnic nationalities people and create real partnerships that are needed to move Burma past the negative legacies of military rule, both economic, political, and social in the country.
So yeah, I mean, this is what the ethnic minorities have been fighting for 60 plus years, is this decentralization. And as a result of that being the cornerstone of the issue between the military and the ethnic groups, the military fears decentralization as a breakup of the country. And so you have a psychological impediment that the military views this as a destabilization of the country and a breakup of the country. And so that's one of the reasons why the peace process as it was is a process of trying to build trust, that they do want to keep the union together, that the ethnic people don't want independence anymore. They still want to be part of a union, but they want it to be federal. They want more power with the states and the federal government. And so it's the aspirations of the NLD, it's the aspirations of the ethnic people, but you do have a psychological barrier that the idea of decentralization has in the minds of the members of the military. The second is from an economic perspective, they want resource and revenue sharing. But the economy is so centrally controlled by the military and a very small handful of their business cronies. Like I said, the two largest companies in the country are controlled by the military. And so when you start to look at, with the NLD, you have to start to look at licensing. So licensing for imports and exports and businesses will be a key opportunity for the NLD to try and decentralize that oligarchy with the military and their business cronies, to try and get at that issue of bringing more resource and revenue sharing to those regions. But the military will resist. They will resist this, and this is going to be an issue in which the international community, international businesses, the international governments can partner with the NLD on how it is to do that. And so how to get the military to sort of agree to no longer have a role in the country's economy. And it's going to be a fight to wrestle that away from them.
Yeah, as was the case in Indonesia. We
Indonesia.
mentioned many times, and
Ongoing.
it still hasn't been resolved. I think it's an important question because I think reform of the military is a prerequisite to any kind of meaningful interaction with the U.S. military. It's not, you're going to have people now that make the argument that either it's a geopolitical thing, that we have to work with the Burmese military because the Chinese, et cetera. That's why I take with a grain of salt a lot of these big geopolitical arguments that are made. And the other one is that it's an inducement to get their cooperation in formation of government and in everything else going forward over the next 4 or 5 months. But I think the reform of the military is just it's absolutely necessary before the U.S. gets engaged in any meaningful way. Well, I think we have to leave it there. But going forward, I got to say, my one, we talked a lot about our worries, and we talked a little bit about our hopes, I suppose. But going forward, I just hope that the attention span in Washington can continue throughout this process. I'm afraid that the developments the next, through March is so much longer than the 2-week news cycle here, that after 2 weeks, things could begin slipping, and then it's not really news here. And you could look at any number of examples where that happens. So I guess in parting, I would just say, I hope we can all stay focused on it, and when it's no longer in the Washington Post every day, we can push to a real meaningful change in Burma using this as an opportunity. And thank you all for coming out.